Most people think they know the Blackbird, maybe the U-2. That's it. That's the extent of public knowledge on America's spy plane program, and it's barely scratching the surface. If you're new here, hit subscribe because we cover the machines history books skip over. What you're about to see are aircraft so classified, so deliberately hidden, that even dedicated aviation historians spend decades piecing together their stories from declassified fragments. Let's start with the one that started it all. Number 1. Lockheed A-12 Oxcart. Before there was the SR-71, there was the A-12, and most people have never even heard the name. In the late 1950s, the CIA needed something faster than the U-2. Something that couldn't be shot down like Gary Power's plane was over Soviet territory in 1960. The answer came from Lockheed's Skunk Works under the direction of the legendary Kelly Johnson. The result was the A-12 Oxcart, a single-seat reconnaissance aircraft built almost entirely from titanium, capable of flying above Mach 3 at altitudes exceeding 90,000 feet. Here's what makes the Oxcart so overlooked. It was a CIA program, not an Air Force One. That distinction meant an entirely different level of secrecy. Test flights happened at Groom Lake, the facility better known today as Area 51, and the aircraft's existence wasn't officially acknowledged by the government until 2007, nearly 4 decades after it was retired. The engineering problems alone were staggering. At Mach 3, the aircraft's skin heated to over 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard aluminum would have softened like wax. Lockheed had to source titanium, much of it secretly purchased through shell companies from the Soviet Union itself, the same country the plane was built to spy on. Fuel presented another nightmare. Conventional jet fuel would simply evaporate at operating altitude, so Lockheed worked with Shell Oil to develop a specialized high-temperature fuel called JP-7. The Oxcart flew operational missions over North Vietnam and North Korea, gathering intelligence no satellite of the era could match. It could outrun surface-to-air missiles simply by accelerating, a defensive capability that sounds like science fiction but was standard operating procedure for these pilots. Only 15 aircraft were ever built, and the program was retired in 1968, replaced by its more famous Air Force cousin, the SR-71. But without the A-12 proving the concept worked, the Blackbird as we know it never happens. Number 2. Lockheed D-21. Now this one sounds almost impossible when you first hear about it. A drone launched from the back of a Mach 3 spy plane designed to fly reconnaissance missions with no pilot at all in the 1960s. The D-21 was Lockheed's answer to a brutal problem. Flying manned aircraft over the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, specifically China's nuclear test facilities at Lop Nur, meant risking American pilots and international incidents if they were shot down or captured. So Kelly Johnson's team designed an unmanned drone that could be carried on the back of a modified A-12 called the M-21 and launched at high speed and altitude. The original launch method proved catastrophic. In 1966, during a test, the drone collided with its mothership immediately after separation, destroying both aircraft and killing the launch control officer. The Air Force scrapped the piggyback method entirely and switched to launching the D-21 from underneath modified B-52 bombers instead, a program renamed D-21B. Here's the part almost nobody knows. The D-21 flew 4 actual operational missions over China between 1969 and 1971, and every single one failed to fully succeed. Film canisters were supposed to be ejected and recovered mid-air by a specially equipped aircraft, but recovery malfunctions, crashes, and one drone that veered into Soviet territory turned the program into a quiet embarrassment. The Air Force canceled it in 1971. For decades, the very existence of the D-21 stayed classified. Surviving drones were literally buried in the Nevada desert rather than risk them being seen. It wasn't until the 1990s that any of this became public, and several of those buried drones were later dug up and put on display. This is one of the strangest chapters in American reconnaissance history, an autonomous Mach 3 aircraft flying real spy missions before most people even had a color television. Number 3. Lockheed U-2 Dragon Lady. Everyone's heard of the U-2. Fewer people understand just how insane this aircraft actually is, and that it's still flying combat missions today, over 70 years after its first flight. Designed by Kelly Johnson in 1955, the U-2 was built for one purpose: fly higher than any Soviet missile or fighter could reach and photograph everything below. It achieves this by being essentially a jet-powered glider, with wings so long and thin that pilots describe landing it as one of the most difficult skills skills in aviation. The aircraft is so unstable at low speed and so fragile at altitude that a second U-2 pilot has to chase the landing aircraft down the runway in a high-performance car, radioing altitude calls to the pilot above. The U-2's most famous moment came in May 1960, when Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Sverdlovsk, Soviet Union, an international incident that nearly derailed a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. 2 years later, U-2 photography over Cuba provided the definitive proof of Soviet missile installations, triggering the Cuban Missile Crisis. Without that single reconnaissance flight, world history looks completely different. What most people don't realize is how the aircraft evolved. The current U-2S variant, still in active service with the U.S. Air Force, bears only a passing resemblance to the 1955 original. It carries synthetic aperture radar, advanced electro-optical sensors, and signals intelligence equipment that can map terrain and intercept communications from over 70,000 feet, well above commercial airspace and most air defense systems. Pilots wear pressure suits nearly identical to astronaut gear, because at that altitude, a cabin depressurization would kill them in seconds without one. The Air Force has tried to retire the U-2 multiple times, favoring satellites and drones instead. Every time, the plane's unique ability to reposition quickly and fly beneath weather that blinds satellites has kept it in service. It remains one of the most enduring and least understood aircraft in American military history. Number 4. Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. If you know one spy plane, it's this one. But even here, the details most documentaries skip are the ones that matter most. The SR-71 flew faster than any other jet-powered aircraft in history, sustained speeds above Mach 3.2, altitudes over 85,000 feet. Its actual top speed remains classified to this day, decades after retirement. But speed alone doesn't explain why the Blackbird was so effective. It's the way the entire aircraft was engineered around evasion. When a missile launch was detected, standard procedure wasn't evasive maneuvering. It was simple acceleration. The SR-71 would outrun the missile before it ever closed the distance. The thermal engineering involved is almost absurd. At cruise speed, friction with the air heated the aircraft's skin to temperatures that would ignite conventional aircraft fuel. Lockheed's solution was to build the Blackbird's fuel tanks with panels that didn't seal properly at rest, meaning the aircraft leaked fuel on the runway before takeoff and only sealed once heat expansion at speed closed the gaps. Pilots called it the leaky lady. The crews themselves deserve more recognition than they get. Pilots wore full pressure suits essentially identical to spacesuits because the SR-71 flew so high that unprotected exposure would be fatal within seconds. Missions lasted hours, required multiple aerial refuelings from specially modified tanker aircraft, and demanded a level of physical endurance closer to test pilot work than typical reconnaissance flying. The SR-71 flew its final operational mission in 1998, officially retired due to cost and the rise of satellite reconnaissance. In its entire operational history, not a single Blackbird was ever shot down by enemy fire, a record that remains unmatched by any comparable aircraft. 32 were built, 12 were lost, all to mechanical failure or accidents, never to hostile action. That statistic alone tells you everything about how far ahead of its time this aircraft actually was. Number 5. Boeing RC-135V Rivet Joint. Unlike the previous 4 aircraft, this one isn't retired, isn't a museum piece, and isn't primarily a story from the Cold War. It's flying missions right now, and almost nobody outside the intelligence community understands what it actually does. The Rivet Joint is built on the airframe of a Boeing 707, but don't let the commercial-looking exterior fool you. Inside, it's a flying signals intelligence platform, packed with over 24 intelligence specialists and equipment designed to intercept, locate, and analyze electronic communications and radar emissions across an entire theater of operations. Where the SR-71 and U-2 gather visual and radar imagery, the Rivet Joint listens. It captures radio transmissions, cell communications, and radar signatures, then processes and distributes that intelligence in near real time to commanders on the ground. This aircraft has been directly credited in declassified assessments with saving American and Allied lives by providing early warning of enemy troop movements, missile launches, and ambushes during conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. Yet because its work happens through electronic listening rather than dramatic high-altitude photography, it rarely gets the recognition aircraft like the SR-71 receive. The fleet itself is remarkably small. Only a handful of rivet joints exist, shared in a unique cooperative arrangement between the United States Air Force and the United Kingdom's Royal Air Force, a partnership that speaks to just how valuable and irreplaceable this capability is considered among allied intelligence services. Each aircraft costs hundreds of millions of dollars to maintain and upgrade, and demand for their missions consistently outpaces the number of airframes available. What makes the rivet joint genuinely rare isn't secrecy in the traditional Cold War sense, it's scarcity. There simply aren't many of them, they're constantly in the air somewhere in the world, and the nature of signals intelligence means the public will likely never know the full scope of what these aircraft have accomplished. That's 5 down. Part 2 covers a Cold War airborne radar station that changed the shape of modern warfare, a stratospheric spy plane pushed past its limits, a Soviet drone still shrouded in mystery, and a reconnaissance jet that flew directly into enemy fire. Number 6. Lockheed EC-121 Warning Star. Before AWACS became a household acronym in military circles, there was the Warning Star, and it's the aircraft that made everything after it possible. The EC-121 was built on the airframe of the Lockheed Constellation, a commercial airliner best known for its elegant triple-tail design. But strip away the passenger cabin, and what the Air Force and Navy created was something entirely new, an airborne early warning platform, one of the first aircraft in history to carry long-range radar aloft, scanning for incoming threats far beyond what ground-based radar could ever detect due to the curvature of the Earth. Development began in the early 1950s, driven by a genuine fear. Ground radar stations had blind spots, gaps an enemy bomber could exploit to slip through undetected. Put that same radar on an aircraft flying at altitude, and suddenly the coverage extends for hundreds of miles in every direction, with no terrain to block the signal. The EC-121 carried both search radar in a large dome mounted on top of the fuselage and height-finding radar underneath, giving controllers aboard the aircraft a three-dimensional picture of everything moving through the airspace they monitored. This aircraft flew a staggering range of missions across multiple decades. During the Cold War, EC-121s formed part of the distant early warning picket line, watching for Soviet bombers approaching North America over the Atlantic and Pacific approaches. During Vietnam, the mission shifted entirely. Warning stars, operating as part of what was called College Eye Task Force, tracked North Vietnamese MiG fighters in real time, radioing warnings to American pilots that gave them crucial seconds to react before enemy aircraft closed to firing range. Military historians have credited this early warning capability with directly improving kill ratios for American fighters during the air war over North Vietnam. The EC-121 also has a darker, less discussed chapter. In April 1969, North Korea shot down an unarmed Navy EC-121M over the Sea of Japan, killing all 31 crew members aboard. It remains one of the largest single losses of American life during a Cold War intelligence gathering incident, and it triggered a serious debate within the Nixon administration about military retaliation, one that ultimately didn't happen, largely because the aircraft was unarmed and the incident occurred during a period of extreme political sensitivity. The Warning Star's legacy is easy to miss because its direct successor overshadowed it so completely. Every principle behind the modern E-3 Sentry, radar aloft, real-time threat tracking, coordinated fighter direction, was proven first by the EC-121, flying missions in propeller-driven aircraft that predate the jet age entirely for this mission set. Number 7. Martin RB-57F Canberra. This is the aircraft almost nobody has ever heard of, and it deserves far more recognition than it gets, because it quietly became one of the highest-flying operational aircraft the United States ever built. The story starts with the English Electric Canberra, a British jet bomber from the late 1940s that the United States licensed and built domestically as the Martin B-57. It was a solid, unremarkable tactical bomber, at least until engineers at General Dynamics took the airframe and radically transformed it into something else entirely for high-altitude reconnaissance work. The RB-57F variant is barely recognizable next to its bomber origins. Engineers extended the wingspan to nearly nearly 122 feet, longer than a Boeing 737, turning a compact tactical jet into something closer to a glider with jet engines bolted on. They added a pair of massive auxiliary turbojets under the wings alongside the primary engines, giving the aircraft the raw power needed to climb to altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet, rivaling the U-2 in some configurations. Why build a second high-altitude spy plane when the U-2 already existed? The answer comes down to specialized sensor payloads and geopolitical flexibility. The RB-57F carried different reconnaissance equipment, including advanced infrared and multispectral cameras, and its larger airframe allowed for a heavier, more diverse sensor suite than the U-2's slim fuselage could accommodate. It also gave American intelligence agencies a second aircraft type for sensitive missions, useful when diplomatic considerations made flying a specific well-known aircraft, like the U-2, too politically loaded for certain operations. The RB-57F flew missions monitoring nuclear test sites, collecting atmospheric samples to detect foreign nuclear detonations, and conducting reconnaissance along sensitive borders, including flights near Cuba and along the periphery of the Soviet Union and China. Because so few were built, only about 21 aircraft converted to this configuration, and because the program operated with minimal public disclosure, the RB-57F never entered the public consciousness the way the U-2 or SR-71 did. Several RB-57Fs suffered structural failures related to the extreme stresses of their extended wings, a sobering reminder that pushing 1940s bomber architecture into stratospheric reconnaissance territory came with real engineering risk. Surviving aircraft were eventually retired and transferred, and today, most people looking at aviation history walk right past this program without ever realizing just how extreme its performance envelope really was. Number 8. Tupolev Tu-141 Strizh. Every aircraft on this list so far has been American. This one isn't, and understanding it means understanding just how seriously the Soviet Union took unmanned aerial reconnaissance decades before drones became a mainstream military tool. The Tu-141 Strizh, which translates to swift, referring to the bird, entered Soviet service in 1979 as a supersonic reconnaissance drone designed to fly deep behind enemy lines, photograph everything below, and return without ever risking a pilot. It's a large aircraft for a drone over 14 meters long, launched from a mobile transport erector launcher using a solid rocket booster, then sustained in flight by its own turbojet engine. What makes the Strizh genuinely fascinating is how it bridges two eras of military technology. It's built with the brute force engineering philosophy of 1970s Soviet aerospace design, rugged, overbuilt, designed for reliability over elegance, yet it performs a mission that wouldn't become standard practice for most air forces until the drone revolution of the 21st century. It could reach speeds approaching Mach 1 and operated at altitudes intended to keep it above most short-range air defense systems of the era. For decades, Western intelligence agencies knew relatively little about the Strizh's actual operational history, since Warsaw Pact reconnaissance programs received nowhere near the documentation and declassification treatment that American Cold War programs eventually did. Its existence was known, its basic specifications were understood, but the details of its missions largely stayed behind the Iron Curtain, and later behind the more limited disclosure practices of post-Soviet Russia and Ukraine, which inherited a portion of the program's infrastructure. The Strizh found a strange second life decades after its Cold War purpose ended. In recent years, aging Tu-141 airframes, some already decades old and technically retired, have resurfaced in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, repurposed in ways their Soviet designers never anticipated, a reminder that Cold War hardware rarely disappears entirely. It just waits for the next conflict that finds a use for it. This is a rare case of a genuinely obscure reconnaissance aircraft stepping back into relevance, decades after most aviation enthusiasts assumed its story was finished. Number 9. McDonnell RF-4C Phantom II. Unlike the high-altitude, ultra-classified aircraft earlier on this list, the RF-4C represents a completely different philosophy of reconnaissance. Fly fast, fly low, get the pictures, and get out before anyone can react. Based on the legendary F-4 Phantom II fighter, the RF-4C stripped out the gun and much of the weaponry, replacing it with a nose section packed full of cameras, including forward, side, and vertical vehicle-facing systems, along with infrared sensors capable of detecting recent activity like vehicle heat signatures or camouflage positions invisible to the naked eye. This was tactical reconnaissance, not strategic. The RF-4C wasn't photographing entire countries from the edge of space. It was flying directly over battlefields, airfields, and troop concentrations at low altitude and high speed, often just a few hundred feet off the ground. That mission profile made the RF-4C's job extraordinarily dangerous. There was no outrunning a missile at Mach 3 from 85,000 feet here. Pilots flew directly into contested airspace, relying on speed, terrain masking, and sheer nerve to get in, capture the imagery, and escape before anti-aircraft fire or enemy fighters could intercept them. During Vietnam, RF-4C crews flew some of the most hazardous missions of the entire war, and loss rates for reconnaissance variants of the Phantom reflected exactly how dangerous that low-level work really was. The RF-4C's information proved invaluable far beyond Vietnam. It flew critical reconnaissance during the opening phases of the Gulf War in 1991, documenting Iraqi troop positions and battle damage assessment that helped shape coalition strategy in real time, a role that satellites and higher altitude reconnaissance simply couldn't fill with the same speed and tactical precision. Ground commanders needed to know what was happening right now over the next ridge, not what a satellite photographed hours earlier on its last pass. What keeps the RF-4C off most people's radar is simple. It doesn't have the mystique of stealth or the record-breaking speed of the Blackbird. It's a workhorse, unglamorous by comparison, flown by crews who accepted extraordinary personal risk for intelligence gathered up close rather than from the edge of space. Most were retired by the mid-1990s, replaced by satellite systems and unmanned platforms, but for nearly 3 decades, this aircraft did reconnaissance work no other platform on this list could safely attempt. Number 10. Boeing E-3 Sentry AWACS. The final aircraft on this list isn't hidden in a desert bunker or buried under decades of classification. It's often flying in plain sight, and most people who see it have no idea what they're actually looking at. The E-3 Sentry is built on a Boeing 707 airframe, instantly identifiable by the massive rotating radar dome mounted above the fuselage, a design so distinctive it's become one of the most recognizable silhouettes in modern military aviation. That dome houses a radar system capable of tracking hundreds of aircraft simultaneously across hundreds of miles, distinguishing between friendly and hostile contacts and feeding that information directly to fighter pilots and commanders in real time. Entering service in 1977, the E-3 represented the direct evolutionary successor to the EC-121 warning star covered earlier in this list, taking the same airborne early warning concept and rebuilding it with jet-age radar and computing power. During the Gulf War, E-3 Sentries directed the majority of aerial engagements, effectively acting as the eyes and coordination hub for the entire coalition air campaign, tracking Iraqi aircraft the moment they left the runway and vectoring fighters to intercept before threats ever became dangerous. What makes the Sentry story genuinely underappreciated is the sheer scope of coordination happening inside that fuselage. Roughly a dozen or more mission specialists work stations inside the aircraft simultaneously, managing multiple engagements across an entire theater of operations, essentially running an airborne command center rather than simply gathering intelligence passively. It doesn't just observe, it actively directs the battle unfolding beneath it. Despite flying constant operational and training missions worldwide, and despite NATO operating its own fleet alongside the US Air Force, most people have never registered what that distinctive radar dome actually represents. It's hidden in plain sight, a reconnaissance platform so visually obvious that its true significance gets overlooked entirely. 10 aircraft, 7 decades of aviation history, from titanium spy planes that outran missiles by simply accelerating, to a Soviet drone finding relevance in a war fought long after its designers assumed it was obsolete. Reconnaissance aviation rarely gets the recognition combat aircraft receive, yet almost every major intelligence success of the last 70 years traces back to one of these platforms, or their direct descendants still flying today.